Ethan Caldwell had it all, or so it seemed. As the CEO of a billion-dollar tech empire, his life was defined by sleek skyscrapers, endless meetings, and relentless ambition. But success came at a price. In the quiet corners of his carefully curated world, there was nothing but silence, a hollow emptiness he had long convinced himself was just part of the sacrifice. That is, until a chance encounter in a city park changed everything. When a bright-eyed little boy approached him and innocently said, "Hey, my mom has a picture of you in her purse," Ethan's carefully controlled life came to a screeching halt. The boy's mother, Clara Evans, wasn't just any woman. She was the one Ethan had let slip away years ago, the person who had once been his anchor before his career became his sole focus. And now there was a child, a boy with a familiar smile and curious eyes that stirred questions Ethan couldn't ignore. Why did Clara still have that picture? And why did seeing her again feel like he was staring into a past that refused to stay buried? As Ethan steps into Clara and Charlie's world, he's forced to confront his own choices, the love he left behind, the wounds he caused, and the life he didn't know he had missed. But Clara isn't the same woman Ethan once knew. Her walls are high, built from years of raising Charlie alone and protecting him from disappointment. Trust isn't easily given, and Ethan must prove that his promises mean more than words. The city park was alive with sounds of children's laughter, dogs barking, and the distant hum of traffic. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting a golden glow on the playground where families gathered. It was a scene of ordinary joy, children chasing each other, parents chatting on benches, and couples strolling along the winding paths. Ethan Caldwell stood apart from it all, his polished black shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit jacket out of habit. It was an odd choice for a leisurely walk, but leisure was not a word Ethan often used. As the CEO of one of the largest tech firms in the country, he had long traded comfort for control. Every part of his life was managed, from the way he dressed to the way he walked and spoke. But today, for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself here away from the sterile, glass-walled office where he spent most of his waking hours. The solitude felt foreign. He had even left his phone behind, a decision that bordered on reckless for someone like Ethan. Without the constant buzz of notifications, the silence pressed in on him, amplifying the loneliness he refused to acknowledge. He was always busy, always important, and yet, standing there by the edge of the playground, watching strangers live their small, simple lives, he felt like an outsider looking through a window he could not open. His gaze drifted to a little boy with sandy blonde hair darting across the grass. The child was laughing as he chased shimmering soap bubbles that floated on the breeze. There was something about the boy's laughter, pure and unrestrained, that caught Ethan off guard. For a brief moment, he felt the corners of his mouth twitch into a smile. It surprised him. When was the last time he had truly smiled? Nearby, a woman sat on a bench with a book in her lap. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, strands framing a face that looked both familiar and distant. She kept one eye on the little boy while turning the pages of her worn paperback. There was an elegance to her posture, a quiet strength in the way she sat still amidst the noise. Something about her seemed calm and untouched, as though life had not yet managed to take its toll. The boy caught a bubble in his small hands and turned to show his prize to the world. When he spotted Ethan watching, he froze for a moment, then tilted his head as if trying to place him. Without warning, the boy ran toward him, sneakers crunching rhythmically on the gravel path. Ethan blinked, surprised. Children did not usually approach strangers, let alone men in expensive suits. "Hey, mister!" The boy's voice was clear and confident, his wide blue eyes filled with curiosity. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." Ethan froze, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "She does?" he asked, his voice soft but uncertain. Are you sure it is me? The boy nodded emphatically. Yeah, I saw it. It's kind of old, though. You look younger in it, but it is definitely you. Ethan's mind raced, the boy's words striking him like a stone thrown into still water. A picture. In her purse? Who was this woman? And why would she have an old photograph of him? He glanced back at the bench where the woman sat. She was watching them now, her expression shifting from relaxed to tense. Her hands gripped the strap of her purse as though she knew exactly what the boy had just said. What's your name? Ethan asked the boy, trying to keep his tone steady. Charlie, the boy said proudly. That's my dog over there. His name is Max. Want to see him do a trick? Ethan chuckled softly despite himself. There was something disarming about Charlie's straightforwardness. Maybe in a minute, Charlie. Can you show me where your mom is? Charlie pointed toward the bench. That's her. Her name is Mom, but other people call her Clara. The name hit Ethan like a jolt of electricity. Clara. It had been over a decade, no, closer to 2 decades since he had last spoken that name. His chest tightened as memories stirred at the edges of his mind. Memories he had buried under years of relentless ambition and work. I think I need to meet your mom, Ethan said, his voice more serious now. His heart thudded heavily in his chest as Charlie grabbed his hand without hesitation and tugged him toward the bench. Each step felt like walking deeper into a past he had tried to forget. Clara stood as they approached, her book forgotten on the bench beside her. Up close there was no mistaking her. Time had softened her features, but had not diminished the quiet strength in her gaze. She looked at Ethan with a mix of shock and apprehension, as though seeing a ghost she was not ready to face. Ethan, she said softly, disbelief coloring her voice. What are you doing here? Clara. His throat felt dry. It has been a long time. Neither of them moved, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them like a curtain no one wanted to lift. Ethan's mind raced with questions, but none seemed appropriate. How do you talk to someone you have not seen in nearly 20 years? Someone who once knew you better than anyone else but now felt like a stranger? Finally, Clara forced a smile, though it did not reach her eyes. I didn't expect to see you here. Neither did I, Ethan admitted. His gaze flicked to Charlie, who was now preoccupied with showing off Max to a small group of children. But it seems your son has a unique way of starting conversations. Clara's face flushed slightly. She glanced down at Charlie and then back at Ethan. I'm sorry if he bothered you. He's curious. No bother, Ethan said quickly, but he mentioned something about a photo. Clara's posture stiffened, her grip on her purse tightening. It's nothing, she said too quickly, her voice betraying her. Just an old photo. An old photo of me? Ethan pressed, his curiosity tinged with something deeper. Why would she still have a photo of him? Why carry it with her all these years? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting away as if searching for an escape. It's complicated, she finally said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan wanted to push for answers, to demand an explanation, but something about the vulnerability in her expression stopped him. He took a small step back, giving her space. I didn't mean to pry, he said quietly. It is just surprising. Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I understand. Charlie's voice interrupted them. Mom? Max did his trick. Did you see? Clara turned to him, her face softening. I saw, sweetheart. Good job. Ethan watched the exchange with a pang of something unfamiliar tugging at him. There was warmth between them, a bond that was both beautiful and painful to witness. For a moment, he envied it. Clara had built a life, and in this brief glimpse, it seemed full of love. I should go, Clara said suddenly, pulling Ethan out of his thoughts. Her voice was steady, but there was a finality to it. It was good to see you, Ethan. Really? Wait, Ethan said, stepping forward instinctively. Can we talk? Just for a few minutes? Clara hesitated, glancing down at Charlie, who was now eyeing an ice cream cart across the path. She sighed, clearly torn. "Okay," she said finally. "But not here." Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. He watched as Clara gathered Charlie and led him away, leaving Ethan to follow at a distance. His mind was a mess of emotions, confusion, regret, and something else he could not name. This chance encounter felt like the beginning of something, though he did not yet know what. As they walked toward a quieter corner of the park, Ethan could not shake the feeling that his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel, thread by thread. And for the first time in years, he did not know if he was ready to see where it led. Ethan followed Clara and Charlie across the park, his polished shoes feeling increasingly out of place on the gravel path. The setting sun bathed the world in warm, golden light, but inside, he felt anything but calm. Questions swirled in his mind, pulling him back to memories he had long buried. Clara Evans. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades, but her presence now brought every forgotten moment rushing back. Clara led them to a quieter corner of the park, near a small pond. Ducks floated lazily on the surface, and the hum of city life seemed far away. Charlie ran ahead with Max, the boys' laughter breaking the tension that sat heavily between Ethan and Clara. She stopped near a bench, motioning for Ethan to sit while she remained standing, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "You didn't have to come," Clara said softly, her tone edged with weariness. "Whatever Charlie said, he doesn't understand. He's just a kid." Ethan ignored the dismissal, searching Clara's face. Time had changed her, but there were still remnants of the girl he had known so well. The sharpness in her eyes, the way she held herself with quiet strength, it was all still there, though tempered by years of something he couldn't yet define. "He said you have a photo of me in your purse," Ethan said carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. "Why would you carry something like that?" Clara looked away, her gaze focused on Charlie tossing pebbles into the pond. "It doesn't mean anything," she said after a moment. "It's just something I kept." "After all these years?" Ethan pressed, though he softened his tone. He wasn't here to fight her, but he couldn't ignore the knot of curiosity and unease tightening in his chest. "Clara, the last time we spoke you know as well as I do, it wasn't under the best circumstances." Clara flinched slightly, and Ethan felt immediate regret for saying it. The truth between them was an old wound neither had dared to reopen. "We don't need to talk about that," Clara said, her voice clipped. "It's in the past, Ethan." "But it doesn't feel like the past," he replied quietly. "Not when you're carrying a photo of me. Not when your son—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "Your son talks to me like I'm someone he should know." Clara's shoulders stiffened. "Charlie doesn't know any better. He's just a curious kid. I told you it's complicated." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The calm he always maintained, the carefully composed facade he wore like armor, was starting to crack. "Then explain it to me, Clara," he said. "Because I don't understand. We haven't seen each other in almost 20 years, and suddenly I'm standing here talking to you because your son told me about an old photo. How do I not ask questions?" Clara's jaw tightened, and she looked as though she was considering her words carefully. Finally, she sighed, her gaze softening just slightly. "Do you remember that summer?" she asked quietly. Ethan blinked, surprised by the shift. "Of course I remember." "That photo was taken then," Clara said. Her voice had an edge of sadness, like the words were harder to say than she wanted to admit. "Before you left for college. Before everything changed." Ethan felt his chest tighten as memories came flooding back. He and Clara, side by side, arms slung around each other as they laughed into the camera. It had been a carefree day at the lake the last summer they spent together before his departure to a university on the other side of the country. They had made promises then, naive and full of hope, promises they couldn't keep. I remember that day, Ethan said softly, his voice laced with something raw. I brought that old camera I used to love. Clara nodded. You said we'd want pictures to look back on. And I believed you. I guess I just never thought that photo would be the last thing I'd have to hold on to. The weight of her words hit him hard, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of Charlie's laughter floated on the breeze, grounding them in the present, even as the past threatened to pull them under. Why did you keep it? Ethan asked, his voice gentler now. He had expected anger or bitterness in her words, but instead, he heard something closer to sadness. Clara hesitated, her gaze still fixed on the water. Because it reminded me of who I used to be, she admitted finally. Back then, I believed in a future that didn't turn out the way I thought it would. I believed in us, Ethan. And when you left, I told myself I had to let it go. I had to let you go. But I couldn't bring myself to throw away that piece of the past. Ethan's throat tightened. Hearing her say it aloud was harder than he expected. He had always told himself leaving had been the right choice, pursuing his ambitions, building a future he thought would make him happy. And yet, standing here now, he couldn't ignore the emptiness that success had brought him. I didn't mean to leave things the way I did, Ethan said softly. I was young, Clara. I thought I was doing what I had to do. Clara turned to look at him finally, her eyes sharp and unflinching. You didn't just leave, Ethan. You stopped calling. You stopped writing. You disappeared. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he couldn't deny the truth in them. He had been so consumed by the future he was chasing that he had let everything else fall away, including Clara. You're right, he admitted, his voice quiet. I let you down. Clara studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if his words were sincere. It doesn't matter now, she said finally, though her voice betrayed a crack of vulnerability. I moved on. I had to. Ethan glanced at Charlie again, who was now kneeling beside Max, scratching the dog's ears as they both basked in the golden light of the fading day. You've done a great job with him, he said softly. Charlie, he's a good kid. Clara's expression softened. He's my everything, she replied. He's the reason I get up every day, even when it's hard. The quiet confession stirred something deep inside Ethan, a mix of admiration and regret. He saw in Clara a life built on resilience and sacrifice, a life he had missed entirely. And yet, there was no bitterness in her words, only love. Does he know? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. About me? Clara's eyes hardened again, and she shook her head firmly. No, and I don't want him to. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. Why not? Because it's not your place, Ethan, Clara said, her voice steady but strained. Charlie doesn't need to be confused by someone from my past. He's happy. That's all that matters. Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that he had a right to know Charlie, to be a part of his life. But he could see the steel in Clara's gaze, the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had built her son's world on her own. He knew better than to push her further, at least not now. Okay, he said quietly. I understand. Clara looked at him for a moment longer, as though trying to decide whether to believe him. Then she turned her gaze back to Charlie, who was now tossing breadcrumbs to a group of ducks. We should go, she said, her voice softer now. It's getting late. Ethan nodded, though he felt like there was so much more he wanted to say. As Clara called Charlie over, the boy ran back with Max trotting happily at his side. Are you coming to the park tomorrow? Charlie asked Ethan, his face bright with hope. Ethan hesitated, glancing at Clara, who was already watching him warily. We'll see, he said, offering the boy a small smile. Charlie nodded, satisfied for now. Max wants to show you more tricks. Clara gently took Charlie's hand and led him away, leaving Ethan standing alone by the bench. He watched them disappear into the growing dusk, his chest heavy with emotions he couldn't name. As he turned to leave the park, Ethan felt a pull deep in his chest, a pull towards something he had long forgotten. It wasn't just Clara or the photo. It was the life he had left behind. A life he now realized might still have room for him if he was willing to fight for it. Ethan walked briskly through the quiet streets, his polished shoes striking the pavement with precision. The sun had set by the time he reached his building, an imposing glass tower that loomed high above the city. Its pristine facade reflected the twinkling lights of the skyline, and its lobby hummed with hushed efficiency. The security guard greeted him with a nod, but Ethan barely noticed. He moved through the familiar space like a ghost, his thoughts miles away in a quiet corner of the park where a little boy had laughed and an old memory had broken free. As the elevator ascended, he leaned against the wall, his reflection staring back at him in the mirrored doors. He looked like the man the world expected him to be. Sharp suit, hair perfectly combed, a face that rarely betrayed emotion. But inside, he felt like something had shifted, something he couldn't quite put back into place. When the elevator doors opened to his penthouse, the contrast was almost jarring. The space was immaculate floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture, and polished marble floors. Every surface gleamed, every detail carefully curated to match his success. But as Ethan stepped inside, the emptiness of it pressed down on him. It was quiet here. Too quiet. Ethan tossed his keys onto the counter and loosened his tie as he made his way to the bar. He poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it absently. For years this routine had been his comfort: silence, a drink, and the faint hum of the city far below. But tonight, nothing felt comforting. Setting the glass down, he sank into the leather armchair by the window and let his thoughts wander back to the park. Clara. It was hard to reconcile the woman he had seen today with the girl he remembered. The Clara from his memories had been light and laughter, a young woman with big dreams and an easy smile. She had been his grounding force in those days, the one who kept him from getting lost in his own ambitions. He remembered their last summer together, just before he left for college. They had spent countless hours by the lake, dreaming about the future. Clara had teased him about his relentless planning, his obsession with control. "You can't map out everything, Ethan," she had laughed, throwing a pebble into the water. "Sometimes you just have to let life happen." But Ethan hadn't listened. Back then, his future had felt like a train barreling down the tracks, unstoppable and inevitable. He had been so certain that leaving was the right choice, pursuing his dreams, building a life that mattered. But now, sitting alone in his sprawling penthouse, he wondered what that life had truly cost him. Charlie's voice echoed in his mind. "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." The thought stirred something deep and unnameable within him. Clara had carried a photo of him all these years. Why? And why had she been so hesitant to talk about it? The answers were just out of reach, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. For a man who built his entire life on logic and control, this was unfamiliar territory. The feelings were messy, unresolved. They didn't fit neatly into his world of contracts, negotiations, and board meetings. The scotch sat untouched on the table as Ethan stood and began pacing. The silence was unbearable now, the penthouse suffocating in its emptiness. It wasn't just Clara that had unsettled him, it was Charlie too. The boy's energy, his bright smile, the way he had looked up at Ethan so openly. Ethan stopped pacing and stared out at the city below, his hands braced against the window frame. He couldn't ignore the resemblance now that he thought about it. Charlie's sandy blonde hair, his wide blue eyes. There was something familiar about him, a connection Ethan couldn't shake. But it couldn't be, could it? Ethan shook his head, dismissing the thought as ridiculous. Clara would have told him if he had a son. She wouldn't have kept something like that from him. Would she? The doubt lingered, persistent and unwelcome. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, and the sunlight filtered through the glass walls of his corner office. The view stretched endlessly, skyscrapers, highways, and a city that never stopped moving. It had always been a view that filled him with pride, a reminder of everything he had built. But today, it felt empty. Ethan sat behind his desk, staring at the stack of reports and contracts that awaited his attention. Normally, he would have buried himself in work, drowning out any unwanted thoughts with productivity. But not today. The photo lingered in his mind, Clara's guarded expression, Charlie's bright curiosity. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. Ethan picked it up, glancing at the name on the screen. It was Daniel Carter, the private investigator he had called the night before. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. He felt guilty for taking this step, for digging into Clara's life without her knowledge. But the questions wouldn't let him rest, and he needed answers. He pressed accept. "Morning, Daniel," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Daniel replied. "I have some preliminary information for you. It's not much yet, but I think you'll find it interesting." Ethan leaned back in his chair, bracing himself. "Go on." "Clara Evans is a registered nurse. She's been living in the same apartment for the last 8 years, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood. From what I can tell, she works long hours, but has no significant debts or financial ties. She's raising her son, Charlie, on her own. No father listed on the birth certificate." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "No father?" "None that I could find," Daniel confirmed. "I'll keep digging if you'd like, but that's what I have so far." Ethan sat in stunned silence, the words echoing in his mind. No father listed. The doubt he had tried so hard to dismiss returned with a vengeance. Was it possible? Could Charlie really be his son? "Keep looking," Ethan said finally, his voice quieter now. "But tread carefully. I don't want to disrupt her life." "Understood," Daniel replied. "I'll be in touch." The call ended, and Ethan set the phone down, his thoughts spinning. He rubbed his temples, frustration building. He had spent years building a life of order and control, but now everything felt uncertain. For the rest of the day, Ethan went through the motions: meetings, phone calls, emails, but his mind was elsewhere. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charlie's smile or Clara's guarded gaze. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his coat and left the office without a word, ignoring the curious glances of his assistant. Ethan found himself back at the park, standing near the same bench where he had first seen Clara. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Children laughed in the distance, and the hum of the city felt softer here. He wasn't sure why he had come, what he expected to find. Maybe he just wanted to feel closer to the moment that had unraveled everything. As he stood there, hands in his coat pockets, a familiar voice broke through the quiet. "Ethan?" He turned and saw Clara standing a few feet away, holding Charlie's hand. She looked surprised to see him, but not entirely displeased. Ethan forced a small smile. "Clara?" Charlie beamed when he saw him. "Hi, Ethan. Max did a new trick today. Want to see?" Ethan's heart tugged unexpectedly, and he crouched to Charlie's level. "I'd love to see it, buddy. Maybe in a minute, okay?" Charlie nodded, running ahead with Max. Clara stepped closer, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I guess I was hoping to see you. To talk." Clara sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Ethan, you can't just—" "I know," he interrupted gently. I need to understand." Her gaze wavered, as if she could see the conflict on his face. She glanced at Charlie, who was happily playing with Max in the grass. "Not here," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Then when?" Clara hesitated, but finally relented. "Tomorrow. Coffee shop on 8th? Noon?" Ethan exhaled. the tension in his chest loosening just slightly. "Thank you." As Clara called for Charlie and walked away, Ethan stood alone once more. The answers he wanted were still out of reach, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving toward them. And for the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't quite name hope. The small coffee shop on 8th Street was unassuming, tucked between a florist and a bookstore. Its wooden sign creaked faintly in the breeze, and the scent of fresh espresso spilled out into the cool afternoon air. Ethan paused outside, his hands in the pockets of his coat as he took in the sight. He had been in countless high-end cafes, sleek modern places where business deals were sealed over overpriced coffee, but this was different. The warmth here seemed more real, more personal. He spotted Clara through the large window, seated at a corner table near the back. She was stirring her drink absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed out the window, as though lost in thought. Ethan took a steadying breath before pushing the door open, the chime above it ringing softly as he entered. The place was quiet, save for the soft hum of conversation and the faint hiss of steam from the espresso machine. A few patrons sat at tables with laptops or books, the peaceful atmosphere a stark contrast to the chaos of Ethan's usual life. He hadn't realized how much he needed this quiet until now. Clara looked up as he approached, her expression carefully guarded. She had chosen a simple sweater and jeans today, her dark hair loosely framing her face. Even now, she carried that same quiet elegance that had always set her apart. "You're on time," she said, as he reached the table. "I try to be," Ethan replied, offering a small, tentative smile. "May I?" He gestured to the seat across from her. She nodded. "Go ahead." Ethan sat, setting his coat across the back of the chair. The tension between them was palpable, as though they were both walking on thin ice, unsure of what lay beneath. He glanced at the paper coffee cup in her hands, the cardboard sleeve marked with little doodles someone had scribbled on it. It was such a small detail, but it struck him as the kind of thing he had stopped noticing in his world of sharp edges and clean lines. "Did you already order?" he asked, trying to ease into the conversation. Clara nodded, lifting the cup slightly. "I did." Ethan hesitated, then waved over the barista, a young man with curly hair and a friendly smile. "I'll have whatever she's having," he said, earning a raised eyebrow from Clara. "Sure thing," the barista replied. "One caramel latte coming up." Ethan offered a polite smile before turning his attention back to Clara. "Caramel latte?" he asked lightly. "I didn't know you liked sweet coffee." Clara shrugged. "Some days, a little sweetness helps." Ethan let the words linger in the air, hearing something deeper in them. He folded his hands on the table, his fingers brushing against the smooth wood. "Thanks for meeting me," he said quietly. "I know you didn't have to." Clara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You were persistent," she replied. "I figured you wouldn't let it go unless we talked." He smiled faintly. "You're probably right." The barista returned with Ethan's drink, setting it down with a cheerful, "Enjoy," before disappearing back behind the counter. Ethan stared at the cup for a moment before taking a sip. It was sweeter than he was used to, but somehow it suited the moment. Clara broke the silence first. "Why are you here, Ethan?" Her voice was soft but steady, the directness in her tone leaving no room for pretense. Ethan sighed, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Because I can't stop thinking about it," he admitted. "The photo. Charlie. You. It feels like I walked into a moment I don't understand." Clara watched him for a moment before responding. "You didn't need to understand it, Ethan. That was never your responsibility. But it feels like it is now," he replied firmly. "Charlie is a great kid, Clara, and you've built a life for yourself. A good one, I can tell. But seeing him has made me realize how much I missed." Clara's jaw tightened slightly. "You didn't miss anything, Ethan. You made a choice back then, And I accepted it. I moved on. Did you? He asked softly. Clara looked away, her fingers tightening around her cup. For a moment, Ethan thought she might shut him out again. But when she spoke, her voice was quieter. It doesn't matter what I feel or what you feel. I did what I had to do. Ethan studied her carefully, his thoughts swirling. He could see the weight she carried, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed perpetually braced against the world. She had been through something he couldn't begin to understand, and part of him hated himself for not being there. "I'm not here to judge you, Clara," he said after a long pause. I wish you had told me." Clara's gaze snapped back to his, sharp and unyielding. "Told you what, Ethan? That I was alone, that I was scared, that I had no idea how to raise a child by myself?" Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the emotion she had tried so hard to contain. "What would you have done if I told you? Would you have come back? Would you have stayed?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. "That's what I thought," Clara said, her voice softening. She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "You were already gone. You had your whole life ahead of you, and I didn't want to be the reason you gave it all up. So I didn't tell you. I made my peace with it." Ethan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He couldn't deny what she was saying. Back then, he had been so driven, so single-minded in his pursuit of success. Would he have stayed? He didn't know, and the truth of that realization made his chest ache. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For leaving, for not being there, for everything." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to gauge his sincerity. The anger in her expression had faded, replaced by something more complicated, something closer to sadness. "I don't need your apologies, Ethan," she said. "What's done is done." Ethan nodded, though it didn't make him feel any better. "I just want to understand, Clara," he said quietly. "For Charlie's sake, if nothing else." At the mention of Charlie's name, Clara's expression softened. "He doesn't know about you," she said. "To him, you're just a stranger we met at the park, and I want to keep it that way. He's happy, Ethan. He doesn't need his world turned upside down." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but gentle. "I don't want to disrupt his life, Clara. I want to get to know him, to be there, if you'll let me." Clara stared at him for a long moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "You can't just walk in and out of his life, Ethan. If you're serious about this, you need to be all in." "I am," Ethan said firmly. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to try." Clara exhaled, a small, weary sound. "We'll see," she said quietly. "But you need to understand, Charlie comes first. Always." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Ethan replied. For the first time, Clara offered him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. As they left the coffee shop, the air between them felt lighter, though the road ahead was still uncertain. Clara walked ahead with Charlie, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder as they made their way down the sidewalk. Ethan followed a step behind, his gaze fixed on the boy who had unknowingly shaken his entire world. For the first time in years, Ethan felt as though he was moving towards something real, something that mattered. And despite the doubts and unanswered questions that lingered, he couldn't ignore the quiet, persistent feeling in his chest. Hope. Ethan's days began to take on a new rhythm, one that felt foreign but strangely grounding. The neatly compartmentalized life he had built, a relentless cycle of meetings, negotiations, and emails, was slowly starting to shift. And it had all begun with a chance encounter at a park. True to her word, Clara had been cautious. At first, she kept her distance, watching carefully whenever Ethan was around Charlie, her guard up like an impenetrable wall. But small moments, Moments of sincerity, patience, and kindness began to chip away at her defenses. It started with Ethan's quiet gestures. On the first Saturday after their coffee shop meeting, Ethan returned to the park at noon. He arrived without fanfare, dressed casually for once, a plain sweater and jeans that felt stiff and unfamiliar. Standing near the old oak tree, he spotted Charlie and Clara sitting on the grass. Max, the energetic golden retriever, bounded in circles around the boy, barking joyfully as Charlie tossed him a worn-out frisbee. Clara noticed Ethan almost immediately. Her posture straightened, her protective instincts kicking in. But when Charlie saw him, his face lit up. "Ethan!" Charlie shouted, jumping to his feet and waving enthusiastically. "You're back!" Ethan smiled, his heart tugging at the boy's excitement. "Hey, Charlie," he said, walking over. "I couldn't miss seeing Max's tricks, could I?" Charlie grinned, holding the frisbee aloft like a trophy. "Max has a new one." "Watch!" Ethan crouched to Charlie's level, watching with exaggerated seriousness as the boy whistled for Max. The dog sprinted over, his tail wagging furiously. With a dramatic flair, Charlie tossed the frisbee high into the air. Max leaped up and caught it mid-flight, landing on all fours with a victorious bark. Ethan clapped loudly, his smile genuine. "That was impressive," Charlie beamed, looking proud. "I taught him that myself." "You're a good trainer," Ethan said, ruffling Charlie's hair gently. It was a simple gesture, but it felt significant. Clara watched from a short distance, her arms crossed as she leaned against the tree. Her gaze was unreadable, but she didn't stop the interaction. "Can you play with us?" Charlie asked eagerly. "Mom says Max needs exercise." Ethan glanced at Clara, as if asking permission. She hesitated before giving a small nod. "As long as you're up for running around, Ethan," she said, her tone guarded but less sharp than before. "I think I can handle it," Ethan replied, rolling up his sleeves. The next hour felt like a dream, one Ethan didn't know he had needed. He chased Max alongside Charlie, the boys' laughter echoing through the park as they played. Ethan wasn't sure when he had last run like this, when he had allowed himself to forget the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, even for a moment. As the afternoon wore on, they finally collapsed onto the grass, breathless and grinning. Max flopped down beside them, panting happily. Ethan lay back, staring up at the sky, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Charlie lay beside him, tracing shapes in the clouds with his finger. "That one looks like a dragon," Charlie said suddenly, pointing to a billowy cloud. Ethan followed his gaze and smiled. "I see it. A dragon flying over the mountains." Charlie looked at him, surprised. "You see it too?" "Of course," Ethan replied. "You've got a good eye, Charlie." The boy's grin was pure and unguarded. Ethan couldn't help but wonder how many of these small, perfect moments he had already missed. The thought stung, but he pushed it aside. He was here now. That had to count for something. When they finally made their way back to Clara, she handed Charlie a bottle of water and watched him drink eagerly. Her gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment before she spoke. "I didn't think you'd actually come back," she admitted softly. Ethan met her eyes, his expression serious. "I told you I wanted to try." Clara nodded, though her face remained wary. "Just remember, Ethan, he gets attached easily. I don't want him getting hurt." "I won't let that happen," Ethan said firmly. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, before looking away, her resolve wavering ever so slightly. "We'll see," she said quietly, echoing the words she had spoken before. Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued to show up, not just physically, but in ways that mattered. One evening, Clara's car wouldn't start after her late hospital shift. Frustrated and exhausted, she had been bracing herself to call a tow truck when Ethan's number lit up her phone. He had called earlier to check in about Charlie's school project, and now, without hesitation, he offered to come pick her up. "It's late, Ethan," she protested. "I don't mind," he said simply. Just tell me where you are." 15 minutes later, Ethan pulled up to the hospital entrance, his sleek black car standing out against the dimly lit lot. Clara climbed in, dropping her bag onto the floor as she exhaled in relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll figure out the car tomorrow." "You don't have to," Ethan replied, his tone calm but certain. "I'll send someone to take a look at it." Clara frowned, looking at him suspiciously. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, glancing at her. "But I want to. Call it a favor." She sighed, leaning back against the seat. "You're persistent, you know that?" "I've been told," he said with a faint smile. Clara turned her gaze toward the window, watching the city lights blur past. She didn't say much for the rest of the ride, but something in her posture softened. Another evening, Ethan showed up at Charlie's school for family night. Clara had hesitated to invite him, unsure if it was too soon, but Charlie had insisted. "I want Ethan to come," the boy said brightly. "He's my friend." Ethan arrived on time, dressed simply in slacks and a button-up shirt. Charlie greeted him with unrestrained excitement, dragging him from one booth to another to show off his art projects and class displays. Clara watched them from a distance, her heart caught in her throat as she saw the way Charlie lit up in Ethan's presence. At one point, Charlie's teacher approached Clara, smiling warmly. "Is that your husband?" she asked, nodding toward Ethan, who was crouched beside Charlie, laughing at something the boy said. Clara's cheeks flushed. "No," she said quickly. "Just a friend." "Well, he's wonderful with Charlie," the teacher replied. "You can see how much your son adores him." Clara looked away, her chest tightening. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know." Later that evening, as they stood outside the school, Charlie ran ahead to show Max the glow-in-the-dark sticker he had gotten from one of the booths. Clara and Ethan lingered by the car, the night air cool and crisp around them. "You're good with him," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence. "Charlie." Ethan smiled faintly. "He makes it easy." Clara looked at him, her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "He's happier since you've been around," she admitted. "But this isn't easy for me, Ethan. Letting you in, it's hard." "I know," he replied gently. "But I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I promise you that." She studied him for a moment, as though searching for cracks in his resolve. Finding none, she nodded slightly. "We'll take it one step at a time." Ethan smiled, a quiet sense of relief washing over him. "That's all I ask." As they watched Charlie play with Max under the glow of a street lamp, Clara let out a soft sigh. "You're different now," she said, almost to herself. Ethan glanced at her. "Maybe I'm just finally starting to figure out what matters." Clara said nothing, but the faint curve of her lips told him she heard him. And as Ethan watched Charlie's laughter fill the night, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe until now. This was the life he hadn't known he needed, and he would do whatever it took to hold on to it. The weeks continued to slip by, and with each passing day, Ethan found himself stepping deeper into a life he had never imagined. Gone were the strictly defined edges of his carefully controlled world. Now, his days were punctuated by laughter, impromptu frisbee games, and Charlie's relentless enthusiasm for showing him every small discovery, from new tricks Max had learned to drawings of dragons and spaceships he had sketched. Ethan, a man used to command boardrooms and analyzing profit margins, now found joy in simpler things, things he had long considered distractions. Yet sitting on the floor of Clara's modest living room one evening, helping Charlie build a lopsided Lego tower, Ethan realized he wasn't distracted. He was present, and it felt more real than anything he had known in years. That night, Clara sat on the worn couch across the room, a cup of tea resting in her hands. She was watching them, Ethan and Charlie, her expression unreadable, but soft. "Okay," Charlie announced with dramatic flair, holding up the final piece of his creation. "It's done, the tallest tower ever." Ethan leaned back, nodding approvingly. Impressive. I think you could give some architects a run for their money. Charlie grinned, proud of himself. Do you want to build one too? Next time, Ethan replied with a chuckle, glancing at the clock on the wall. It's getting late, buddy. Your mom might have me kicked out if we're up all night building towers. Charlie's face fell slightly, but he nodded obediently. Okay, I'll get ready for bed. He stood and trotted down the hall, Max at his heels, leaving Ethan and Clara alone. The silence that followed was comfortable, but tinged with something unspoken. Clara set her cup down and leaned back against the cushions, her gaze drifting toward the window. He really likes you, she said softly. Ethan's smile faltered, replaced by something more serious. I really like him too, he replied. Charlie's a great kid. Clara nodded, though her expression grew distant. He's never really had anyone in his life like you. It's always just been me. Ethan studied her carefully, hearing the unspoken weight behind her words. Clara had carried it all alone for so long. He couldn't imagine what that must have been like. You've done an amazing job with him, he said earnestly. I mean it, Clara. She turned to look at him, her eyes flickering with something that looked like uncertainty. I tried, she said quietly. I'm still trying. Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Clara looked at him sharply, as if the words had stung. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan met her gaze steadily. It means I'm here. I want to help. I want to be part of Charlie's life, and yours, if you'll let me. Clara's posture stiffened, her guard snapping back into place. It's not that simple, Ethan. Why not? He pressed gently. I know I missed a lot. I can't change that, but I can be here now. I want to. Clara shook her head, looking away. You say that now, but what happens when the novelty wears off? What happens when work gets too busy, or when this doesn't fit into your life anymore? Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady, but filled with quiet conviction. I'm not walking away, Clara. Not this time. She stared at him, her expression unreadable, before finally sighing and pushing a hand through her hair. I've had to be careful, Ethan. For Charlie. He's been let down before, not by you, but by life. I can't risk someone coming in and then leaving again. I can't let him get hurt. I understand, Ethan said softly. But I'm not leaving. Clara looked at him for a long moment before standing. It's late, she said quietly, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. Ethan nodded, recognizing the wall she had just put up between them. He grabbed his coat and stood, his movements slow. Good night, Clara, he said. Thanks for letting me spend time with him. She gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Good night, Ethan. As he left her apartment, walking down the quiet hallway toward the elevator, Ethan felt a heaviness settle over him. He could feel Clara pulling back, retreating behind the walls she had spent years building. And yet, despite her reluctance, he knew he was closer to breaking through than he had been before. The following weekend brought an unexpected storm. The morning sky turned gray, rain falling steadily against the city as thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Ethan stood by the window of his penthouse, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching the sheets of rain wash over the skyline. His phone buzzed on the counter, breaking the quiet. He glanced at the screen and felt a small jolt of surprise when he saw Clara's name. Hello? He answered quickly. Ethan. Clara's voice came through, her tone laced with something between frustration and amusement. Do you own a raincoat? Ethan blinked, caught off guard. A raincoat? Yes, she said. Charlie and I are stuck inside and he's bouncing off the walls. We're going to the park with Max Rain or not. If you're serious about sticking around, you'll meet us there. Ethan couldn't help but smile at the challenge in her voice. I'll be there, he said without hesitation. The park was nearly empty when Ethan arrived, the rain falling in a steady drizzle that soaked through his coat. He spotted Clara and Charlie under a large tree, Max trotting happily in circles as Charlie giggled and waved at him. "Ethan!" Charlie called out, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "You weren't kidding about the rain," Ethan said as he reached them, pushing his dripping hair back. Clara smirked, clearly enjoying his discomfort. "You said you could handle it." Charlie ran over, grabbing Ethan's hand as Max barked and tugged at his leash. "We're playing splash tag," Charlie announced. "You're it." Before Ethan could react, Charlie darted away, his sneakers splashing through puddles as he laughed wildly. Ethan turned to Clara, who raised an eyebrow. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "are you going to let him win?" Ethan grinned despite himself and took off after Charlie, his shoes sinking into the wet grass. He hadn't run through the rain in years, let alone splashed through puddles like a carefree child. But now, with Charlie's laughter ringing in his ears, he didn't care. Clara stood beneath the tree, watching them. For a moment, the rain didn't seem to bother her at all. There was something about Ethan chasing after Charlie, his laughter mixing with her son's, that tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. Ethan finally caught Charlie, sweeping him up in his arms as the boy shrieked with joy. Max barked excitedly, circling them as Ethan turned toward Clara. "You're next," he called, his grin wide and unguarded. Clara shook her head, laughing softly. "Oh no, you two are on your own." As Ethan set Charlie down, both of them soaked to the bone and grinning like fools, he caught Clara watching him. Her smile faltered slightly, her gaze soft and distant, as though she were seeing something she wasn't sure she could trust. Ethan met her eyes, his expression serious but warm. "This is what matters," he said softly. Clara looked away, brushing a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe," she replied, her voice quiet. "But it's still hard to believe." Ethan didn't push. He simply crouched beside Charlie, who was now drawing patterns in the wet grass with a stick. The rain fell around them, soaking their clothes and washing away any pretense. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to wonder just for a moment if maybe, just maybe, she could let Ethan in. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the rain-soaked streets and casting long streaks of light through Clara's apartment window. Inside, the smell of coffee and pancakes filled the small kitchen, where Clara stood by the stove, flipping pancakes while Charlie sat at the table drawing on a napkin. Max, ever hopeful, lay by Charlie's feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "You're making a mess again," Clara said playfully, eyeing the crumbs from Charlie's toast scattered across the table. "It's not a mess, Mom," Charlie said without looking up. "I'm making art." Clara smiled to herself, shaking her head. "Of course you are." There was a knock at the door, and Clara froze, her spatula pausing mid-air. She glanced at the clock. It was earlier than she had expected anyone to stop by. Charlie immediately perked up, craning his neck toward the door. "Is that Ethan?" he asked eagerly. Clara hesitated before answering. "It might be. Sit still, I'll check." Her heart beat a little faster as she walked to the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to see Ethan standing there, holding a small paper bag and a to-go cup of coffee. He looked different from when they had first met again at the park, less put together, but somehow more approachable. His hair was slightly mussed, his sleeves rolled up casually, and the guarded expression he used to wear so naturally had begun to soften. "Morning," Ethan said with a small smile, holding up the bag. "I brought breakfast." Clara raised an eyebrow, but she stepped aside to let him in. "You do realize we already have pancakes, right?" "Pancakes are great," Ethan replied, shrugging, "but no one ever says no to pastries." Charlie popped up from the table at the sound of Ethan's voice, his face lighting up. "Ethan, did you bring donuts?" Ethan grinned, handing the bag to Charlie. "You'll have to look inside and see." Charlie grabbed the bag eagerly, Max now fully alert and circling him in hopes of a fallen crumb. Clara crossed her arms, watching the scene unfold. It was strange how quickly Ethan had become a fixture in their lives, and how seamlessly he seemed to fit into the quiet chaos of her world. She wasn't sure if that comfort made her uneasy or reassured her. Ethan turned to her, his smile softening. "I know it's early," he said. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "You're here now," Clara replied, motioning for him to sit at the table. "Might as well stay." They ate breakfast together, an odd but natural scene that neither of them could quite explain. Charlie was in high spirits, bouncing between talking about his latest drawings and how Max had learned a new trick, something Ethan had been instrumental in teaching. Ethan listened intently, asking questions and laughing at Charlie's dramatic storytelling. Clara found herself watching them more than she cared to admit, her heart tugging in ways she couldn't quite define. After breakfast, Clara leaned against the counter, arms folded as Ethan helped Charlie rinse his plate in the sink. "You don't have to do that," Clara said. "I can handle the dishes." "I'm capable of rinsing a plate," Ethan said lightly, though he caught the edge in her tone. He turned to face her, leaning back against the sink. "I'm just trying to help." Clara looked away, trying to suppress the unease building inside her. "You're doing too much, Ethan." He frowned slightly. "Too much?" "Yes," she said firmly, turning her gaze back to him. "You're here all the time now. Charlie is getting used to you. He asks about you every day. I'm worried about what happens if this stops." "It's not going to stop," Ethan said calmly, though his voice held a trace of frustration. "I've told you I'm not walking away." "You say that now," Clara shot back, her voice rising slightly. "But what if you get tired of this? What if your life gets too busy again? Charlie has been let down before, and I won't let it happen again." The words hung in the air like a weight. Charlie, blissfully unaware of the tension, was now playing with Max in the living room, his laughter filling the space. Ethan looked at Clara, his expression softening. "I understand why you're afraid," he said quietly. "But I'm not that person anymore, Clara. I've spent years chasing the wrong things, thinking they'd make me happy. They didn't. You and Charlie, this feels real. I don't know how else to prove that to you." Clara opened her mouth to argue, but something about the sincerity in his voice stopped her. She could see it in his eyes that this was not a man speaking in empty promises. And that scared her even more. "Proving it takes time," she said finally, her voice softening. "You don't just get to walk in and expect me to trust you." "I know," Ethan replied, "and I'm willing to earn it." Clara looked at him for a long moment before turning away, her voice quiet. "We'll see." That afternoon, Ethan stayed longer than he had planned. It wasn't anything grand, a walk to the nearby park with Charlie and Max, a game of catch that left them all laughing, and a quiet moment on the bench where Ethan and Clara sat side by side, watching Charlie play. For once, the silence between them didn't feel heavy. It felt comfortable. "I used to think I had everything figured out," Ethan said suddenly, breaking the stillness. Clara turned her head slightly, looking at him. "Oh?" He smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on Charlie as the boy raced Max across the grass. "I thought if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, everything else would fall into place. I'd be happy, but I wasn't." Clara's voice was softer now. "And now?" Ethan looked at her, his expression unguarded. "Now, I think I was looking in the wrong places. I thought success would fill the gaps, but it never did." Clara studied him carefully. It was strange to hear him speak this way. The man she remembered had always been so certain, so focused on the future, that he never paused to look at the present. This version of him felt different. "You've changed," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I had to." Clara turned her gaze back to Charlie, who had flopped onto the grass, laughing as Max licked his face. It's not just about proving it to me, you know, she said softly. It's about proving it to him. I know, Ethan replied, and I will. That night, after Ethan had left and Charlie was tucked into bed, Clara found herself standing alone in the kitchen, staring at the sink full of dishes. She sighed, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for a glass of water. Ethan's words from earlier echoed in her mind. I've spent years chasing the wrong things. You and Charlie, this feels real. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that people could change, that maybe Ethan's presence in their lives could be something good. But years of disappointment had made her cautious, and her instinct to protect Charlie was stronger than her desire to hope. Clara walked to her purse hanging by the door and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the photo, and she pulled it out, staring at the familiar image of two people who had once dreamed of a different life. The girl in the photo looked lighter, brighter, as though she had no idea how heavy the world could become. Ethan looked carefree, his smile wide and full of possibility. Clara traced the edge of the photo with her thumb, her chest tightening. For years, she had carried this as a reminder of what she had lost. But tonight, for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, it could also be a reminder of what might still be found. With a deep breath, Clara tucked the photo back into her purse and turned off the light. For the first time in a long time, hope crept into the quiet corners of her heart, and though it scared her, she didn't push it away. The wind carried a chill the following morning, rustling the trees outside Clara's apartment. Inside, the small living room was bathed in soft morning light, the calm before the day truly began. Clara was at the kitchen counter, packing Charlie's lunch for school while he sat at the table, his feet swinging under the chair as he happily finished his cereal. Max lay sprawled nearby, paws tucked under his chin as he dozed. "Mom, do you think Ethan will come to my game tomorrow?" Charlie asked, looking up with hopeful eyes. Clara's hand paused mid-reach for the apple she was packing. She turned to face him, offering a small smile. "I'm sure he'll try, sweetheart." Charlie grinned and went back to spooning the last of his cereal. Clara stood still for a moment, her smile fading. She had noticed something subtle over the past weeks, Charlie's growing attachment to Ethan. Every question, every mention of his name carried excitement, a kind of hope that unnerved her. Ethan's presence had already left a mark, and while part of her wanted to let herself believe it was for the best, a deeper part of her still feared it all falling apart. Clara finished packing Charlie's lunch and glanced at the clock. "Go grab your backpack, honey. We need to leave in 5 minutes." Charlie nodded and dashed off down the hall, Max trotting close behind. Clara rubbed her temples, the weight of her thoughts pressing in. Before she could give it too much room, there was a knock at the door. Her heart skipped. She wasn't expecting anyone this early. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she walked over and opened the door to find Ethan standing there, a takeaway cup of coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. He looked both casual and comfortable in a dark sweater and jeans. But there was something different about him this morning, a sense of hesitation she hadn't seen before. "Good morning," he said, offering a small smile. "I thought I'd catch you before you headed out." Clara blinked at him, caught off guard. "You're here early." "I know," he admitted with a shrug. "But I brought breakfast." She hesitated, glancing back toward the hallway where Charlie's voice echoed faintly. "Ethan." "Clara, just let me in for a minute," Ethan said softly, his tone carrying a quiet urgency. "Please." There was something in his voice that made her pause. With a reluctant sigh, she stepped aside and let him in. Ethan set the coffee and bag on the counter and leaned against the edge, his gaze fixed on her. Clara folded her arms, narrowing her eyes slightly. "What's going on?" she asked. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I want to talk to you about something." "About Charlie." Clara stiffened. "What about him?" "I've been thinking a lot," Ethan said carefully. about how much time I've already missed, and how much he means to me. He met her gaze, his expression serious. I want to take a real step forward, Clara. I want to be in Charlie's life officially fully, not just as some guy who shows up at the park. Clara stared at him, her heart thudding heavily in her chest. What are you saying, Ethan? I want to be his father, Ethan said firmly, his voice steady but soft. I want to take responsibility for him. I know it won't be easy, and I know it will take time, but I want to be there for him. For you. Clara felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. You can't just decide that, she said, her voice shaking. It's not that simple, Ethan. I know it's not simple, Ethan replied, his eyes pleading with her to understand. But I'm not walking away from this. I've missed so much already, and I can't keep pretending I don't care. I do, Clara. More than I've cared about anything in years. You don't understand what you're asking for, Clara shot back, her voice rising. This isn't a game, Ethan. This is Charlie's life. You can't come in here and make promises you might not keep. I'm not making empty promises, Ethan said, his tone firm now. I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I'm not the same man I was back then. Clara shook her head, her chest tightening. You say that now, but what about 6 months from now? A year? When things get hard, when your perfect life doesn't fit around us anymore. What happens to Charlie then? Ethan flinched at her words but didn't back down. That won't happen. I won't let it. Clara laughed bitterly, her voice cracking. You can't guarantee that, Ethan. You don't get to come into our lives and play hero. I've done this on my own for 8 years. Charlie doesn't need someone who's going to disappear the moment things get inconvenient. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Ethan said nothing. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fear behind her anger, the fear of letting him in, of risking everything she had worked so hard to protect. You're right, Ethan said quietly. You've done it all on your own, and you've done an incredible job, but that doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone. Clara swallowed hard, her arms tightening around herself as though bracing for a blow. I can't take that chance, Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I won't let him get hurt. Before Ethan could respond, Charlie's voice called out from the hallway. Mom, I'm ready. Clara turned away quickly, wiping at her eyes as if to erase the emotions threatening to spill over. We're leaving, she said, her voice steadying. You should go. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but then stopped himself. The fight drained out of him as he watched her shoulders tense, as though carrying the weight of her entire world. He nodded slowly, his voice soft. I'll see you both soon. The drive to school was quieter than usual. Charlie, sensing his mother's mood, chattered less than normal, focusing instead on drawing shapes on the fogged-up window with his finger. Clara gripped the steering wheel tightly, Ethan's words replaying in her mind like a broken record. I want to take responsibility for him. You don't have to keep doing this alone. When they reached the school, Charlie unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack. Are you coming to my game tomorrow, Mom? Of course, Clara said, managing a small smile. I wouldn't miss it. Do you think Ethan will come? Charlie asked, his voice filled with innocent hope. Clara froze for just a second before forcing a neutral tone. I'm sure he'll try. Charlie smiled, oblivious to her hesitation, and waved as he disappeared into the school building. Clara sat in the car for a moment longer, staring at the steering wheel as tears stung her eyes. She hated that Ethan's words had gotten to her, that they had cracked open a part of her heart she had worked so hard to lock away. She couldn't let herself believe he would stay. She couldn't let Charlie get hurt. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. Later that afternoon, Clara received a call from Charlie's school. The receptionist's voice was calm, but carried an edge of concern. Mrs. Evans, Charlie had a little accident during recess. He's fine, but he fell and hit his arm pretty hard. We think it might need to be looked at. Clara's heart dropped. I'll be there in 15 minutes. When she arrived at the nurse's office, Charlie was sitting on a small cot with his arm in a sling, his face pale but brave. It's not too bad, Mom, he said quietly. The nurse explained they suspected a sprain, but recommended getting an X-ray to be sure. Clara's mind raced as she knelt in front of Charlie, brushing his hair back gently. It's okay, sweetheart. We'll go to the doctor and make sure everything's fine. Can we tell Ethan? Charlie asked suddenly, looking up at her with hopeful eyes. I think he'd want to know. Clara froze for just a moment before forcing a smile. Let's focus on you for now. As they walked toward the car, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced down to see a text from Ethan. Thinking about you both today. Hope everything's okay. Clara stopped walking, staring at the screen as her heart thudded in her chest. For the first time, she wondered what it would feel like to let Ethan in fully. Maybe it was time to find out. The waiting room was colder than Clara remembered. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, and the scent of antiseptic filled the air. She sat stiffly in one of the plastic chairs with Charlie beside her, his small body leaning against her side. His arm, secured in a makeshift sling, was cradled gently in his lap. He hadn't cried, not once, but his usual bright energy had dimmed, replaced with quiet fatigue. It's going to be okay, Clara murmured, brushing a hand through his hair. Charlie looked up at her, his face pale but calm. I know, Mom. I'm brave. Clara managed a small smile, though her heart was heavy. You are, sweetheart. The bravest. She was about to say more when the sound of hurried footsteps broke her thoughts. Clara looked up to see Ethan striding toward them, his coat dusted with raindrops and his face lined with concern. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes locking onto hers before shifting to Charlie. Clara, he said softly, his tone carrying an edge of urgency. Is he okay? Clara blinked, surprised. How did you? You didn't tell me, but I had a feeling something was wrong, Ethan said simply, his gaze steady. When you didn't reply to my text, I called the school. Clara opened her mouth to argue something about boundaries, about not needing him to charge in like this. But when she saw the genuine worry in his expression, the words fell away. Instead, she sighed and leaned back against the chair. We think it's a sprain, but they're doing an X-ray just to be sure, she said quietly. We're waiting for the doctor. Ethan crouched down so he was level with Charlie, his voice soft and gentle. Hey, buddy, how are you holding up? Charlie offered a tired but brave smile. I'm okay. It doesn't hurt that bad. Ethan's lips quirked into a small smile. Tough kid, he glanced at Clara. Mind if I sit? She hesitated briefly, but then nodded. Suit yourself. Ethan lowered himself into the chair on the other side of Charlie, his presence filling the space in a way that somehow made it feel smaller, but not in a bad way. Clara glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He looked tired, as if he had dropped everything to be here, and maybe he had. Charlie leaned his head back against Clara's shoulder, his eyes fluttering closed. Ethan watched him quietly for a moment before speaking, his voice low. You should have called me. Clara stiffened. I didn't think it was necessary. Clara, he said, turning his gaze toward her. This is necessary. He's my son too, whether you want to admit it yet or not. She met his eyes, her pulse quickening. She knew this moment had been coming, creeping closer with every interaction, every step forward Ethan had taken into their lives. Ethan, don't what? He interrupted gently. Don't care? Don't show up. His voice softened even further, his eyes earnest. I know you're scared. I know you're used to doing this on your own, and you don't want to let me in. But I am here, Clara. I want to be here. You don't have to keep pushing me away. Clara looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Her throat tightened, and her hands instinctively smoothed over Charlie's hair. "I'm not pushing you away," she said quietly. "I'm trying to protect him." "From what?" Ethan asked softly. "Me?" She didn't answer, but the silence said enough. Ethan let out a slow breath, leaning back against the chair. "I know I haven't earned your trust yet," he said finally, "but I will." The X-ray confirmed it was a mild sprain, just as the nurse had suspected. Charlie was fitted with a soft sling and sent home with instructions to rest and keep his arm elevated for the next few days. By the time they left the hospital, evening had fallen, and the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. Ethan walked them to Clara's car, holding an umbrella to shield Charlie from the misty rain. Max wasn't with them tonight, left at home out of practicality, and the absence of the happy dog made the world feel quieter. When they reached the car, Clara opened the door for Charlie, helping him settle into the back seat before closing it gently. Ethan stood beside her, holding the umbrella over both of them. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the rain tapping softly against the canopy above them. "Thank you for coming," Clara said finally, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "I didn't expect you to, but I'm glad you did." Ethan's expression softened. "I'll always come when you need me, Clara, whether you expect me to or not." Her chest tightened at his words, her defenses cracking just a little more. She looked down at her feet, her voice trembling. "It's hard to trust that." Ethan didn't push, didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, his hand steady. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Something I wrote," Ethan said quietly. "Read it when you're ready." Clara took the paper reluctantly, slipping it into her pocket without looking at it. "Okay?" Ethan nodded. "Good night, Clara. Take care of him." She glanced toward the car where Charlie was watching them through the window, his face sleepy but curious. "I will." As Ethan turned to leave, Clara stood for a moment, watching him disappear into the night. The paper in her pocket felt heavy, as if it carried all the words she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. She wanted to tear it up, to pretend it didn't matter, but something stopped her. When they got home, Clara settled Charlie into bed, tucking the blankets around him carefully. He looked up at her, his voice soft and sleepy. "Ethan was worried about me," he said, smiling faintly. "He was," Clara replied, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "He cares about you, Charlie." "I know," Charlie murmured. "He's like a superhero. He always shows up." Clara's chest tightened again, a pang of guilt threading through her. "Get some sleep, sweetheart. We'll talk in the morning." Charlie nodded, his eyes fluttering closed. Clara sat with him for a few minutes, watching his breathing slow and even out before she stood and quietly left the room. In the stillness of her small living room, Clara sat on the edge of the couch, the folded piece of paper in her hands. She stared at it for what felt like forever, before finally smoothing it out and reading the words Ethan had written. "Clara, I know I let you down before. I know I made mistakes I can't undo, and I can't take back the years I wasn't here. But I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. I care about Charlie. I care about you. If you let me, I'll prove it not with words, but with time. I'll show you I'm the man you and Charlie deserve. I hope someday you'll believe me." Clara read the note twice, her heart aching with every word. She set it down carefully, staring at the handwriting strong but imperfect. It was Ethan. All of him, laid bare. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to hope, truly hope, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The sun was warm, spilling over the park's green grass, where families gathered under the open sky. It was one of those rare autumn days when summer lingered, the air crisp yet bright with the promise of a new season. Clara sat on the sidelines of the small baseball field, a cooler of juice boxes at her feet. Parents lined the bleachers around her, murmuring cheers and idle conversation as the kids prepared for their game. Charlie stood near the dugout, his arm still in a sling, but his excitement wasn't dulled in the slightest. He wore his team's oversized jersey, the name Falcons emblazoned across the front in bold letters. Max sat obediently at Clara's feet, panting in the warmth, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. Charlie waved toward her. "Mom, is Ethan here yet?" Clara shifted, glancing at the entrance to the park, where people milled about, coming and going. She hadn't told Ethan about the game this morning, though she had considered it. The note he had written still lingered in her thoughts. She had tucked it carefully into the small drawer by her bed, and every night the words found her again. "I'll show you I'm the man you and Charlie deserve." Clara wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe. She cupped her hands around her mouth, calling back to Charlie. "I don't know, sweetheart. Just focus on cheering your team." Charlie looked disappointed for a second, but then he smiled brightly and nodded. "Okay." Clara watched him with a soft ache in her chest. He was so resilient, so full of life. For years, she had worked tirelessly to be both mom and dad, filling every gap so Charlie would never feel what was missing. And yet, despite all her efforts, Ethan had slipped into their lives and begun filling a space she hadn't even realized was empty. A flicker of movement at the park's entrance caught her eye. Clara turned, her breath catching slightly as Ethan walked toward the field. He was dressed casually jeans, a jacket over a simple gray shirt, and he carried a small tote bag slung over one shoulder. When he spotted her, he offered a quick wave before making his way over. "Ethan," she said as he reached her, surprised at the way her pulse quickened. "I didn't think you'd come." Ethan smiled faintly, crouching to scratch Max behind the ears before looking up at her. "I didn't know if I was invited," he admitted, "but I couldn't miss Charlie's big day. Sling or no sling." Clara glanced toward Charlie, who spotted Ethan immediately and lit up like a firework. He waved frantically from the field, shouting, "Ethan, you made it!" Ethan straightened, his expression softening as he waved back. "Wouldn't miss it, kiddo." Clara watched the exchange, her walls beginning to crumble just a little more. She gestured toward the bench beside her. "Sit, there's room." Ethan lowered himself onto the bench, setting the tote bag at his feet. "I brought snacks," he said casually, unzipping the bag to reveal bottles of water, a couple of apples, and a bag of popcorn. Clara quirked a brow, the corner of her mouth lifting in amusement. "You're prepared." "I try," Ethan replied, his voice easy but tinged with something earnest. "If I'm going to show up, I'm going to do it right." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as Charlie joined his teammates near the first baseline to cheer them on. He bounced on his heels, his face flushed with excitement, his sling doing little to slow him down. "He's happy," Ethan said softly, breaking the quiet. Clara nodded, her gaze lingering on Charlie. "Yeah, he's always been a happy kid. I'm lucky that way." Ethan turned to look at her, his voice careful. "You've done an incredible job, Clara." Clara swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. "I've done my best." Ethan's voice lowered, softer now. "You didn't have to do it alone." She looked at him sharply, her defenses instinctively rising. "I did have to. You weren't there." Ethan didn't flinch at the truth in her words. Instead, he nodded. "I wasn't, and I can't change that." He looked back toward the field, his expression pensive. "But I'm here now, and I'll keep showing up, Clara, for you and for Charlie." Clara let out a slow breath, her gaze softening. "You keep saying that." "Because I mean it," Ethan replied, "and I'll prove it, as many times as it takes." The game was lively, even with Charlie sidelined due to his injury. He stood with his teammates the entire time, cheering louder than anyone else, as though his voice alone could push them to victory. Ethan watched with pride, clapping and shouting encouragement alongside Clara. During a break, Charlie ran over to them, his face flushed with excitement. "We're winning! Did you see when Kevin hit the ball super far? It almost went into the parking lot." "I saw it," Ethan said, crouching down to Charlie's level. "You've got a great team out there." Charlie grinned, then turned to Clara. "Mom, can I get ice cream after the game?" Clara hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who smiled faintly. "Ice cream sounds like a great idea." Charlie's eyes lit up. "Can Ethan come too?" The boy's innocent question made Clara freeze for just a moment. Ethan, sensing her hesitation, straightened and gave her a reassuring look. "Only if it's okay with your mom." Clara looked between them. Charlie's hopeful expression, Ethan's quiet patience, and something inside her shifted. She exhaled and nodded. "Okay, ice cream it is." Charlie cheered, spinning in circles with his good arm, while Ethan offered Clara a grateful smile. Later that afternoon, the three of them sat at a small outdoor table outside a local ice cream shop. Charlie dug enthusiastically into a scoop of chocolate ice cream, while Max lay under the table, occasionally being offered a small treat by Charlie. The boy chattered non-stop, reliving the highlights of the game as Ethan listened intently. Clara sat back, watching them, the sunlight catching in Ethan's dark hair as he laughed at one of Charlie's exaggerated stories. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine this, really imagine it. Not just Ethan showing up on occasion, but Ethan being there, being part of their lives. It was terrifying. But it was also something she hadn't dared hope for in years. After a while, Charlie ran off to throw his napkin in the trash, leaving Clara and Ethan alone. Ethan looked at her across the table, his voice gentle. "Thank you." Clara frowned slightly. "For what?" "For letting me in," he replied softly. "I know it hasn't been easy for you." She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the table. "It's still not easy." "I know," Ethan said, "and I'm not asking for anything more than this. For now." Clara met his eyes, searching for cracks in his resolve, but found none. All she saw was sincerity. "Charlie likes you," she admitted quietly. "More than likes you. I think he needed someone like you." Ethan's expression softened. "I needed him too." Clara's heart twisted at the honesty in his words. For so long, she had carried the burden of protecting Charlie on her own. But for the first time, she realized she might not have to anymore. Ethan looked at her carefully, his voice low. "One day, I hope you'll trust me enough to tell him." Clara swallowed hard, emotions threatening to rise. "One day," she whispered. As Charlie came bounding back, Max at his side, Ethan leaned back in his chair, smiling as the boy launched into another story. Clara watched them, a small, tentative smile on her lips. For years, she had believed it was safer to do everything alone, to never let anyone get close enough to hurt her. But Ethan had proven something she hadn't wanted to believe, that people could change, and sometimes they came back when you least expected it. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a life where she didn't have to carry everything on her own. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara let herself hope. The golden glow of the setting sun bathed the park in soft light as Clara, Ethan, and Charlie sat together on the same bench where it all began. Charlie tossed a frisbee for Max, whose happy barks echoed through the open space. The air was calm, the quiet hum of the evening settling around them. Ethan leaned back on the bench, his arm resting on the backrest, close but not overstepping. Clara sat beside him, her gaze fixed on Charlie as he ran across the grass, carefree and full of life. "He's happy," Ethan said softly, breaking the silence. Clara nodded, a faint smile on her lips. "He is." Ethan glanced at her, his voice low but steady. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Clara turned to him, her eyes holding a mixture of vulnerability and something warmer trust. "Thank you for proving you're here to stay." In that moment, they didn't need to say anything more. It wasn't perfect. The road ahead would have its challenges, but together, they could face them. It wasn't about fixing the past, it was about building a future one step at a time. Charlie's voice rang out, bright and clear. "Ethan, come throw the frisbee with me." Ethan grinned, standing up and brushing his hands off. "You got it, buddy." Clara watched as Ethan jogged toward Charlie, his laughter blending with her son's. The sight filled her with something she hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't a dream, it was real. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe in second chances. As the sun sets on this emotional journey, we are reminded that life often gives us unexpected chances, opportunities to heal, to forgive, and to build something beautiful from the pieces of the past. If this story moved you, if you felt Clara's fears, Ethan's determination, or Charlie's innocence in every moment, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Here, we tell stories of hope, resilience, and love stories that remind us of the quiet strength within all of us. What's your favorite second chance story? Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness or forgiveness changed your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Remember, sometimes the hardest roads lead to the most beautiful destinations. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that inspires your heart.